Good evening, and welcome, Earthlings of the world. I always think, where else could they be, really, if they're called that, Ronnie? But
They'd have to be on Earth, wouldn't they?
I suppose they would, yeah.
Otherwise, they'd be Martians or Venusians
Yeah,
or
unless they'd been abducted or something
whatever.
as we do. So, welcome everyone to Still Alive. As you can see, we are. Are you healthy and alive, or just alive?
I'm okay. I thought I had a bit of a cold coming on over the weekend, but it seems to have gone away, so I'm fine.
Excellent, very good. Well, that's good news. So that
and
means
I'm getting
we're
a
both...
cup of tea now, so that I'll be feeling even better when I.
Well,
me lights It's Louise. It's right. That's why there's disruption. It's Louise. It disrupts wherever she goes. There we are.
Yeah. Well, here's a trade secret. You wouldn't believe Ronnie's setup. I mean, it's to do with washing lines and.
It's I've got a light on the back of a balance on the back of a chair attached to one of the cat's blankets. Because our ceiling light, the ceiling light here where where I am's not working, so I've got like a plug-in light one side, and I've got this contraption with the kind of USB light in front of me. So it might look like a posh professional studio, but it's actually not really.
Well, I don't think either of us look like that, but we'll let that go. The main thing is that we're still alive. So we're going to be talking about language quite a lot, Ronnie, and tyranny is a good word. But before we start, let me remind everyone that if they're not on my YouTube channel, that's the best place to be for the chat. And of course, we don't have a policy of making anybody pay to have their opinions and thoughts put on the screen. So we'll never do that. And so that's the the kind of caveat to that. In a way. So tyranny of the week, Ronnie, and what's that got to do with Lilliput?
Well, yeah, the illustration is from that was on Facebook and YouTube, to advertise this show. It's from Gulliver's Travels, and Lilliput was a place where people were like really, really small, but they were able to kind of defeat much bigger people, I suppose, by acting in unison, which in some ways it's got like really good connotations. But it's an example of of the weak, in a sense, kind of hampering and defeating the strong, I suppose, in a sense. And I feel that's very much happening in quite a few different ways. With the struggle for animal liberation. I mean, first of all, the reason why animals are other animals are oppressed and exploited in the first place is very much due to weakness. It's due to the weakness of those people who contribute to that. The people who can continue consuming animal products, for instance, and are kind of too weak to stop that and to switch to a vegan-friendly diet, for instance. I mean, that's the huge area of weakness that's causing the massive oppression and exploitation of other animals. And obviously, contributes massively to the tyranny of humans over those other animals. And then you've got that weakness is encouraged. That weakness in people is encouraged by those people who profit from the oppression of other animals. By those industries that advertise and promote animal products and other forms of the oppression of other animals.
Just to clarify, Ronnie, when you say weakness, because I think that, or weak, that might you know, that people might think. I mean, are you thinking about lack of strength of mind, or
lack of moral fortitude, really? That people, you know, people haven't got the strength to kind of to go with what's morally right, and they kind of rather go with what's kind of comfortable in a sense for them,
like convenience, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because obviously, obviously when you go vegan, it means that you kind of become different to the majority of other people, and you kind of have to, you have to kind of stand your ground. It does demand a certain amount of strength, and I think there are people that kind of that lack that strength, or don't want to put themselves out to kind of to stand up strong for veganism. And so it is a weakness, but that weakness leads to the most horrendous tyranny.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting that about the that we become different from everybody else. And I suppose a vegan mindset. In fact, that's going to be an interesting thing to talk about a little later when we get onto the language. But Bob and Jenna Torres used to run a radio show, and also they have a book which has got a pretty ableist term. It was called Vegan Freaks. I don't know if you remember that.
I kind of vaguely do remember that title. Yes, yeah.
But they were kind of looking at the idea from a sociological point of view, which is the fact that we are kind of different from the mainstream, and because of that, we kind of stand out as different, and perhaps a little bit more. What could you say? Kind of determined. We'll put ourselves out more. We don't need to conform as much. Not to say that we're complete rebels or anything, but I mean, I think there is that kind of element, but there's also always a little bit of we're swimming against the tide type attitude, and so that's why they called it that.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's very much because we've got the strength to stand up for what's right. I mean, it's really isn't it really is a very simple thing to understand, that the oppression and exploitation by humans of other animals is morally wrong. We shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, if you think about the very beginning of the vegan movement, their determination to do what they saw as right was life-threatening according to everybody else. I mean, I always tell the story that they were told they were going to die, even by doctors, because at the time it wasn't understood that humans can thrive on a plant-only diet, and so they expected all the vegans to die, and so they said, "Well, we'll do it anyway." I always say, risk it for a vegan biscuit, and they decided to go for it, because it was the right thing to do.
And they were strong in that sense, but they're also strong in the sense that there were so few of them, and it was far, far more unusual to be vegan in those days than it is now. So they stood out even more from the crowd.
Well, all the people at that garden party you went to stood out, didn't they, Ronnie? So,
well, yeah. I mean, I think in the early days of kind of veganism, that before it kind of it kind of really wasn't in a sense part of the animal rights movement, because like the concept of animal rights really arose in the 1970s, but obviously the vegan society had kind of existed quite some while before then, and there'd been people who were vegans, and I when I first became vegan, it kind of goes to show how few vegans that there were around at the time. I kind of they invited, I think, every vegan in the country to go down to a garden party that was being held in down in Surrey, at the home of one of the leading lights in the vegan society. I'm not sure whether it may have been Serena Coles
Can you remember the year, Ronnie? Can you remember the year?
It would have been yes. I think it was. I think it was probably 1972 because that was the year I became vegan.
Well, that's far too early for it to be Kathleen Janaway then. So yeah,
it was and I kind of went there because I was like you know, I was active in Hunt Sabs and stuff like that, and you know, and campaigning on various animal rights issues, and I probably a little bit expected them to be the same, but they kind of weren't, and well, most of them weren't, and they were into some like really weird stuff. I remember the first thing that kind of greeted me when I arrived at the house was there was a guy hanging upside down from a beam, and I shook hands with him, and he was hanging upside down. You see, and he said, "I suppose you're wondering why I'm hanging upside down." I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Oh, it's to do with everyone should hang upside down for a period of time every day because it sends the blood to the brain and it nourishes the brain," which is probably totally unscientific. I think blood goes to the brain anyway. So the heart pumps it to the brain, doesn't it? But this is kind of what. And it was a warm summer's day. I think it was June. And there was a guy there wearing loads of overcoats. And I asked him, "Why are you wearing loads of overcoats?" He said, "It's to keep the aura. It's to keep the aura close to the body." I thought, blimey, what have I got myself into? Do you know what I mean? It's like there are these people.
Well, at least there wasn't anybody in a tin hat. I suppose
a lot of them were like kind of really, really strange and into all sorts of other. It's happening again now with you know the number of vegans. I mean, I find it kind of quite depressing in a way. The number of vegans that are into all these weird conspiracy theories now. Just go on Facebook, you see it all the time. It's just like kind of what's happened, you know. And it was a bit like that. They were into other weird and wonderful things, or weird and perhaps not so wonderful things, as well as being vegan, you know. And we've got that kind of coming back now, and I think that's like a kind of real shame because our focus should be on animal rights, animal liberation, vegan education. That's our focus, not on lots of other weird unscientific stuff. But anyway, that kind of changed because as the animal rights movement grew, a lot of the kind of animal rights campaigners who are really, you know, we're all campaigning on single issues in those days, but a lot of those people actually became vegan by rubbing shoulders with vegans that were already involved in those campaigns. And so the kind of, I suppose, the sort of demographic, if that's the right word, of vegans became much more kind of what I would call, you know, perhaps normal inverted commas, or people that were just into, into, animal rights, animal liberation, social justice, right, rather than into all sorts of weird and wonderful mumbo jumbo, if you see what I mean. They were people that were just kind of focused on these very rational, very clear objectives. It became much more like that then.
Okay. Well, all right. I got a little series of questions because we started this by saying that let's talk about welfare and rights, which seems to be a conversation in the movement that has died away to the extent that, you know, people don't seem to. I think people are very confused within and outside the movement about welfare and rights.
Yes.
And you know, it is a bit kind of I think the spiritual vegan might be so might be thinking about mumbo jumbo that you just said, Ronnie. But okay, so so to illustrate that, we've got a few videos to kind of illustrate where I want to go with this. But
yes,
but I wonder, as a general first question, Ronnie, is the problem us and not them? In other words, is it time for us to simply accept that this is an animal welfare movement and that the advocates are happiest and more comfortable using animal welfare language they're often uncomfortable using animal liberation or animal rights language. Often they don't know that kind of language. And so I just wonder whether we need to accept that this is the nature of the movement. It's not as though it's changed. It's kind of constantly been welfarist all the time.
I think we have to accept that there's a lot of people like that. There's a lot of people that who are vegan or consider themselves vegan that use welfarist language rather than liberationist or rights language. I think that we kind of have to accept that as the reality. That's what's going on, but that doesn't mean we need to go along with it. I mean, I think we should still constantly advocate the importance of using, what I would call liberationist language rather than welfarist language or rights language. We need to constantly assert that. I think, and I think that I think that's vital.
Yeah, you see, I think it's almost like we've got a second wave of kind of new welfarism almost now, where it used to be that people used to think that, campaigning for welfare and campaigning again and campaigning again and campaigning would eventually lead to animal rights. Whereas now the connection that is made by the activists is between animal welfare in terms of anti-cruelty and being opposed to animal abuse, these kind of RSPCA words, and veganism.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's what interests me in the sense that you've got a group of people now that seem to be determined to try to get society to say, well, look, we need to redefine your words to how vegans see it. Okay, because what you've got really is they try and associate veganism with words like animal abuse and animal welfare, which the dominant paradigm and the dominant culture of society see as associated with animal welfarism, and it's always been taught that way. So people have got a very kind of long-standing and thorough understanding of what those words are. So when vegans come, they're almost like saying to people, well, even though what I'm saying doesn't fit the cultural understanding of it, if you don't agree with me, then you're an abuser. And so we've got this weird kind of strategy going on at the moment in the movement, where we're using animal welfare language and trying to make a direct link to veganism with it, whereas it used to be that we had animal welfare campaigns which they thought had an eventual link to animal rights.
Yes. You see, I think the mistake people make is thinking that non-vegans attribute the same meaning to those words as they themselves as vegans do. Yeah, I think that's the kind of major problem. Whereas, like, if you're kind of trying to educate people and change people, you've got to kind of have an understanding of how those people think.
Yeah, and you also have to engage them in a conversation. I mean, we've got a couple of clips really where if you're talking about being an animal lover and kicking cats and dogs, and everybody's on the same page, and then as soon as you switch it to talking about slaughterhouses, it confuses people, because animal cruelty and the abuse of animals have got nothing to do with that from the point of view of the general culture. So if you do want to redefine it, you need to then engage them with a conversation and to actually explain that this is what we'd like to do in terms of cultural shift, if you like. Whereas there's a lot of people now, just at that point, they go, okay, well, you're just an animal abuser. And so the educational value of these things kind of ends, because it's almost there's like a kind of gotcha going on, And so I was wondering about whether there's a distinction to be made between this idea of vegan education as it's understood, and then this idea, which I think was first brought into the movement by AV, which is this notion of, what's it called? Holding non-vegans to account, that kind of idea. Now,
yes.
I think a lot of vegans think that is vegan education. Well, I'm not sure if it is.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, non-vegans, are accountable. I mean, non-vegans bear responsibility. They create the demand for, they're basically paying other people to kill animals for them, aren't they? And that's the reality of the situation. But what we need to think about, what everyone needs to think about, who wants to educate others to go vegan, is, what effect do the words they say have on those other people, if you see what I mean, and kind of accusing people of being animal abusers. I don't see how that is helpful in terms of educating those people to go vegan.
No, I don't see that. Joanna has said that vegans can't be welfareists, but in terms of the video clips, I'm going to show a little edit, a very short edit, I think it's less than 2 minutes now, which I took from Andy's film. Animal rights were getting it wrong, and this kind of starts the kind of it kind of lays the foundation of where we want to go today. So let me start with that.
There's a growing concern that the original philosophy may be slowly being diluted, if not completely lost, in order to make way for a new one which is far more welfarist in nature, where abolition is replaced with the reduction of suffering and improving the lives of those who will still only exist to be used or taken from. Certainly not any kind of compromise, or worse still, regression, and those original values were never intended to be diluted or reduced. The idea of campaigning for better standards and more efficient forms of exploitation in the likes of welfare groups and legislation is essentially not only a complete lack of respect for our foundations, but more importantly for the victims that those foundations were set up to liberate, not continue to use in a nicer environment. Yet worryingly, that seems to be an ever-growing view within the collective. Simply through the use of their language they use or the media they share, this reducitarian paradigm is sweeping in. Which brings us on to the penultimate section of this film. How did we get here?
The question I ask myself is, if I can live in a way that reduces animal suffering, why wouldn't I?
Asking others to be as vegan as possible is also beneficial because it asks for reduction, which people are more receptive to than they are to full veganism.
It's a relatively young movement. It's about food.
To think that every use is necessarily abuse is, I think, a mistake. I mean, there can be, like I said, a give and take, and that is what I call a symbiosis. Living together, humans and animals, the problem is, of course, they cannot give consent.
I want to create a world which is more ethical and reduces animal suffering as far as possible.
I use the phrasing reduce suffering, and I guess that is the principle I align with more.
I think that people are so concerned about suffering that they tend to lead activism into a welfare position.
But can we please stop reducing veganism to a welfare movement where all we talk about is animal cruelty? We're not campaigning for comfier cages, and every time you talk about just cruelty, that's where people's heads go.
Okay, so that's the kind of opening to it. And it seems, because one thing that is pretty clear now is that cruelty is the dominant word within the movement right now.
Yes,
closely followed by abuse, an abuser, and so it's kind of interesting in the sense that even if you think about the official vegan definition, where it says exploitation of and cruelty to, so cruelty is in that as well.
Yes,
it is the second word, not the first.
Yes,
often, advocates will often reverse them. And Andy pointed out that there was some streams when people are actually physically reading out the definition, and they still reverse it, even though it's right there in front of them, as it were, because of this kind of dominance of the word. And as I said, I think then that it's caused confusion, and I think this is why the modern day advocates often rail against an organization like the RSPCA. But the irony there is the RSPCA are more in tune with the cultural understanding of those words than vegans are. And so there's a heck of a lot of work to do if you want to redefine these long-standing understandings, which we're socialized into them. Cultural speciesism, a big part of that is animal welfare ideology. And so even things like, for example, teaching kids, don't be cruel. So whether it's the new puppy in the house, or whether we're talking about pulling wings off flies and killing spiders, then often parents will say to children, don't be cruel, but that's got nothing to do with veganism. And so this kind of link that vegans are trying to establish, I think we're going to have to accept that if we want to do that as a strategy, we've got a heck of a lot of work to do, which is, certainly not going to be done by calling people abusers as soon as they get confused by what we're saying.
No.
And then in terms of welfare, I always point out, Ed's book here, where he kind of talks about the red tractor and the paradox of the RSPCA. And, these issues, he mainly talks about these welfare issues and says, well, the red tractor is not working. Well, from an animal rights point of view, it wouldn't matter if it worked or not. He was on the TV arguing with a slaughterhouse owner the percentage of times that the stunning was done properly. From the animal rights point of view, it doesn't matter. And then he put like a cartoon out about this issue that he talks about in, of all things, a TED Talk. So let me have a quick look at that.
A survey conducted by the British Cattle Veterinary Association, and it revealed that every single year, 150,000 cows are sent to the slaughterhouse while pregnant. It went on to show that 40,000 of these pregnant dairy cows are in the late stages of pregnancy, meaning that the baby inside of them could well be capable of independent life. Now, there are no real legal guidelines to protect unborn calves, but the RSPCA, which is Britain's leading welfare organisation, has a set of guidelines that it advises slaughterhouses should follow in the event of a pregnant cow being sent to their slaughterhouse. And the guidelines are as follows. It says that the cow should be killed in the same way as she would normally, which is a bolt in.
Yeah, so I'm just going to stop that and say this gets a little bit graphic, but not too bad.
The head to stun her before she's hung up on the line and has a knife pulled across her throat so that she bleeds to death. However, they then state that the cow should be left on the bleeding line for at least 5 minutes to ensure that the baby inside of her has time to die as well. And so often, what can happen is the mother cow will be cut open and the baby inside of her is still alive, breathing, conscious. And so the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, states that the humane way to kill a baby who has just been cut out of their dead mother is to shoot them with a bolt or hit them over the head with a blunt instrument. Their first and last experiences of life are on the floor of a slaughterhouse.
Oh yeah, now wait a minute. I shouldn't have done that. Let me go back to there. This is from the blurb. This bit here, which is really interesting. So this is the blurb of the video. If you care about animals or consider yourself an animal lover, you owe it to the animals and yourself to go vegan. So that's where they're making this connection between animal welfare, being an animal lover, straight to veganism, which culturally is kind of incoherent. And then for more information on how to reduce the animal cruelty, the thing that Andy highlighted in the film, you pay for, and to go vegan, go to howtogovegan.com, which probably the person who organizes howtogovegan.com would be probably mortified if they knew that Earthling Ed was using their website to promote his kind of like version of welfare veganism. But when he says the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, as though that's meaningful from an animal rights point of view, it's not.
No, because, and you know, it was never meant to cover the cases that he kind of claims should be included within it. It was always about it was about like the kind of more extreme end of the ill treatment of other animals.
And also a selective group of other animals too.
Yeah, and more to do with animals like dogs and cats and those animals, you know, animals that people consider as pets in inverted commas.
Yeah. So yes, it is, Jeremy. I think Gary Francione is trying to make himself as popular as Russell Brand at the moment, but we'll leave that. Yeah. So the way that this is getting constructed in the modern times, I'm going to show you a couple of very brief clips of street work that has been done by Cliff Grant in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And this is where you get this situation that as soon as people don't agree with the vegan definition of things, they're an abuser.
Thoughts on animal abuse? Like,
what do you think?
Why is it that I'm completely against any form of animal abuse?
Are you sure about that? Because 99% of people in this street tell me the same thing, and then they turn around and justify it after like a couple of questions. So I normally ask people.
You're challenging me already.
I am. In a friendly way, but in a friendly way. Yeah. I normally ask people
and I've been a vegan. No, I'm not a vegan anymore. No,
see, there you go.
I don't agree with.
But you told me you're against animal abuse, and then you're not vegan. That's why I'm here.
Right, to turn.
So how can you be against animal abuse and not be vegan? How does that make any sense?
Oh well, then obviously I'm for animal abuse. Okay.
You are obviously. Yeah. Well, you fund it.
Right, and so it seems to me that once you get to that difficult area, that's when you need to talk about culture, and you need to say, well, look, I understand that we're now talking about these words in a different way. Let's talk about that, right? So to actually just go for, well, you're an abuser at that stage seems to me not to have much of an educational component to it. Another thing about it, Ronnie, is it's very popular. That gets lots of views and also lots of comments. I just switched to this for a second. So these are some of the comments. First of all, there's a comment from non-vegan. Eating other animals is not abuse. It's called being part of the food chain. So again, that person is articulating the cultural understanding of that word, right? Which is not the vegan understanding of that word. And then somebody said, in theory, she's against animal abuse, but in practice, she endorses and supports it by being non-vegan. Now, that bit is putting together two elements which culturally don't fit, because everybody is against animal abuse. You go down your street and ask people, are you against animal abuse? Or ask them, are you against animal cruelty? And you can guarantee that virtually everyone will say yes, right? Which is exactly what they do when Cliff asks them that question. And then he switches to slaughterhouses. And that's when they get confused, because those words have got nothing to do with slaughterhouses and veganism, right? And so it's at that point that we need to be able to have a conversation where we explore the confusion between the two definitions, the kind of traditional cultural one, if you like, and the definition that the vegans are trying to, they're trying to redefine it. Yeah. So yes, it would take a bit of skill to do that. And then this is the answer to that top question there. Eating other animals is not abuse. And so the response is usually this: stabbing animals in the neck is not abuse, right? And so, question mark. Okay. And so this is the attempt to redefine, but there's no discussion, and that's the bit that kind of interests me, in the sense that we've got this construction now in the vegan community that there's a direct link between these welfare words, which are essentially RSPCA type words, and veganism. And then if you try and make this case just as is made on the street, you run smack bang into the wall of cultural speciesism every single time, because people don't know. Suddenly they're on board with you, and then suddenly they don't know what you're talking about, and you don't explain the switch. You just use it to then say you're an abuser. And the question for you, Ronnie, is that is very popular in the movement, but it doesn't seem to be much to do with education to me. But it's to do with clicks and, you know, a lot of comments, things like, oh, you know, you showed her, you exposed that person's hypocrisy, you know, all that kind of stuff. That nobody's ever saying, you know, some people say when they get home they're going to think about it and say, oh, I'm a hypocrite and everything. I don't think
I'm not sure.
I
think it's a sort of combative style, isn't it? And
yeah, but that's holding them to account. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't think that you see. You know, I've had cases where I've been discussing veganism with someone and they've not agreed, and then sometime later I've spoken to them again, they become vegan. And it's because I didn't hold them to account, and so because they didn't go away from the conversation disliking me, it meant that they were able to carry on thinking about what I said afterwards. And when they later on thought more about what I said, they came to the conclusion that I was actually right, and they became vegan. Now, if you create a situation where somebody dislikes you, if you accuse somebody of being an abuser and that kind of thing, they're very unlikely to do that. A wall is going to be put up between you and them, and they're much less likely to rethink what you said.
Yeah,
and in fact,
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, in that conversation, kind of nothing was said about the reasons for being vegan.
No, and yet
didn't go anywhere.
The setup, which is, you know, asking a few questions. What do you think about animal abuse? Everybody goes, oh, I'm against it. Like that woman said, I'm totally against it, right, and all that. And then it used to be a question of, okay, well, give me an example. And every single time it was kicking cats and you know, abusing dogs and hitting horses and all the rest of it, and that. And so everybody's on board there in the conversation right at the start until the switch comes. But the switch is where the education needs to be engaged.
Yes, I think if people were to be asked, you know, what do you, are you against animal abuse? They go, yes. What do you consider to be animal abuse? Give me some examples of animal abuse, and they're going to talk about the dog and the cat and the horse being kicked and those things. And then you would say, well, then you could ask them, well, what about, say, when an animal's killed in a slaughterhouse? Do you consider that abuse?
And that's exactly what happens. But
yes,
that's when they kind of go, hang on a minute, I understood what you were saying a minute ago, but now I don't.
If you ask them that and they say, no, that's not abuse, then you could say, well, why do you consider that not to be abuse? And then you have a conversation from there. Because you see, I think they consider that they consider sort of abuse to be, I think probably they would define it as cruel treatment, wouldn't they? In a sense, and they that was kind of gratuitous in a way. It wasn't necessary, and because they think, well, it's necessary for these animals to be killed for us to eat, therefore that what is done to those animals then becomes acceptable and it's not abuse. I think that's probably the way their minds are working.
As cultural speciesism, they've internalized the message that there is no abuse or cruelty in a slaughterhouse. Now, to a vegan ear, that is a difficult thing. But from the culture, that's exactly right, because that's what animal welfare teaches. And going back to Ed, that's what the RSPCA's job is, to ensure that you can send other animals through something called a slaughterhouse, but you don't create cruelty and you don't create abuse, because they've got a particular understanding of those words.
You see, I think it could be argued that from the point of view of animal liberation, it'd be better if the RSPCA didn't exist at all. Because for all the kind of positive stuff they do, like in prosecuting people for, for kicking cats and dogs and horses, as in the recent case where the woman was acquitted, of course, you consider that to be a positive side. There's a huge negative side where they're actually encouraging people to consume animal products by giving all these animal farms that the RSPCA approved, whatever the reg tractor. I don't know whether I think
it's called RSPCA assured now.
Assured, by giving, what they're doing then is they're encouraging those people to carry on consuming animal products. And when you weigh the two up together, I think it could be argued that it'd be better if for the kind of the progress of animal liberation, for the RSPCA not to exist.
Yeah. And or for them presumably to kind of stay in their lane, to use the phrase.
Or for them to,
in a sense, they do, though, Ronnie. I mean, they do stay in their lane.
Yes.
But when the vegans come along, because another weird thing about the Earthling Ed fallout is that a lot of his people, his fans, thought the RSPCA was a vegan organization. And the reason for that is what he said, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, therefore vegan. Now, so we've imposed that understanding on something that is completely the opposite in mainstream culture.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with veganism, the RSPCA. Never has.
No, none whatsoever. Nothing whatsoever to do with veganism. I mean, there are vegans, and there may be vegans on their ruling council or committee or board or whatever they call it. Whether there are now, I know at one time there were quite a few vegans on there, but those vegans didn't turn the RSPCA into a vegan organization. All they were able to do was make some small improvements, such as the RSPCA coming out against hunting, which at one time it didn't. It wasn't against hunting, and it was vegans that are elected to their committee that changed that.
Hunting at one time, wasn't it?
Yeah, but they weren't able to turn the RSPCA into a pro-vegan organization at all.
No, because that would be outside the RSPCA's remit. I mean, all we've got to do is remember that the RSPCA is a traditional animal welfare organization. So their job is to regulate animal use. It's not, they don't see themselves as abolishing it, except in places like the hunting thing, which was an aberration to their general thing. The main thing they do is see, well, look, other animals are going to be used, so we need to kind of regulate it, which is exactly why they put together all these guidelines about what to do if you find a pregnant mother in your slaughterhouse. For them, the thing that outrages Ed, for the RSPCA, that's just their job. That's what what they do.
Yeah, it's a misunderstanding of what they are. It's two things: a misunderstanding of what the RSPCA is and what it was set up to be, and secondly, a misunderstanding of how non-vegans, the meaning that non-vegans attribute to words like cruelty.
Yeah, that's right. This is interesting from Vegan Pundit. Bite Size Vegan dropped a video recently about the psychology of people not liking vegans. Yeah, I saw the reference to that, and we'll check that out. But apparently, Emily's doing some research about what's going on, because there are some polls where vegans come very low in terms of their, as it were, standing. I think we're just above, some very kind of dodgy
just
people.
above Gary Glitter.
Yeah, I think it's something like that. Yeah, I think it is. And then final bit of video, because when you said about, well, what is going to be the reaction? Are they gonna thank you for engaging with them, or are they going to be offended? Time and time again with these videos, people get offended, and so if you offend somebody and you insult them, you can't educate them.
No,
I mean, you can't educate somebody else by insulting them.
No,
right?
Not at all.
And if that, you know, but it is popular within the movement because it's that kind of, you know, you've kind of, you know, you've done a blow for veganism.
Yeah. It's a lack of you know, it's a failure to think deeply enough about the issue, because it's a very surface thing to think, oh, you got one over on that non-vegan, well done. You know, that's like an immediate surface thing. But when you think, well, hang on a minute, though, isn't the important thing to educate people to become vegan? And when you think about it at that kind of deeper level, then obviously it's not a good thing to do that.
No, I mean, we just need to have a bit more cultural understanding, I think. So the final bit of film kind of illustrates the fact that, you know, there's no kind of education going on in this setup. There is a bit of fruity language in this particular one, and also the person is pretty aggressive, so probably wouldn't be that conducive for education in the first place. But you know, there's no attempt.
So I don't care. I'm not interested. I want to talk to people who love animals. Not people.
I love animals.
Yeah, you told me you were pro animal abuse the other day over at City Hall.
What?
You told me you were pro animal abuse the other day over at City Hall. Yeah. So I'm not interested.
Okay, well I'm going to set up an animal sanctuary.
That's all right. Do it.
It's going to be called here. It's going to be called.
Mate, I'm not interested.
Keep the light out.
Not interested.
You're a fucking winder, man.
So there's other videos where people are saying things like, I thought you were a nice person, because it doesn't go well, because there's nothing there anymore for them to talk about, because you've set up a kind of, you don't agree with me on the definition of this word, which you've known all your life, that cruelty and abuse, and you know, and so that means that if you don't adopt my word, my definition of that word that you've known all your life and what the culture has taught you for all your life, then you're an abuser. So then you start calling them names, and then education is just nowhere to be seen after that.
No, but there's no discussion around that word with the person, is there? There's no discussion about, well, what do you consider to be abuse? And there's no that discussion isn't ended into at all, is it?
No. Vegans are second to drug addicts, apparently, with regards to social ostracizing. And Jeremy's asking about research. I'm assuming, well, Bite Size Vegan is obviously very research heavy. So I would chase up that link that we talked about. And then Jeremy come back with, tend to agree and try to avoid this myself. However, offense seems to be yeah, well, that is true. I mean, some people will take offense no matter how diplomatic or, you know, calm you are and everything. I expect we were all offended when we started living vegan. I expect we were all offended. I'm not quite sure what that means. What does that mean? I suspect we were all offended when we started living vegan. No, you'll have to clarify that, Jeremy. I don't know.
Well, we could have been regarded as being... People maybe regarded us as, I don't know whether offensive is the right word, but like strange and weird and perhaps a bit threatening. Those were probably the way that people kind of looked at. I mean, certainly back in the day when it was much more unusual to be vegan, I think people felt kind of, people often feel threatened by something that's unfamiliar, don't they?
All the time.
Because,
yeah.
And I think because it was so unfamiliar in those days, now it's much more familiar. You know, we see the word vegan everywhere. There are a lot more people who are vegan, and so it's much more familiar with people. So I think that kind of threat caused by unfamiliarity isn't nearly as great now as it was.
No, I've noticed a downside to the familiarity argument, because we've noticed in Dublin, back on the street, that there's a lot less engagement. I mean, if I look at my kind of Facebook memories that pop up, you got a gazebo being kind of surrounded by people, 15 people, 8, 9, 10, a crowd of people around. And you will be lucky to get that number for an entire day now. And I think that part of it is because people think that they know what vegan is now because they've seen it all over the supermarkets.
Yeah, they just think it's some strange diet, perhaps.
They think it's a diet, yeah. And so, we're not able to educate them about that, because they don't even feel the need to come over, ask any questions, because they think they've been there, got the t-shirt, understand that, don't need to ask anything else. I'm convinced that that's what's going on.
It could be that. It could be a kind of COVID effect. I think the whole COVID thing, the lockdown, is that has kind of altered people's behaviour, and kind of in some ways made people less social and wanting to keep more to themselves. And I think that could be an effect of that as well.
Joanna makes an interesting point. It's almost like a university seminar point. The majority of humans are actually not intelligent. Otherwise, they would be able to take in new information and apply it, etc. But we could be very reflexive about this. I mean, to what extent have we taken in new information and applied it? Apart from the, as it were, going vegan bit, I mean, are we doing this on a ongoing kind of process of, seeing what's around? I mean, obviously for us, Ronnie, we've got a generational thing going on in the movement. But I mean,
yes,
to what extent are we kind of taking on board what they're doing and thinking about it and adopting it? I mean, I think you probably argue that that's what you do.
Well, I think yes, and I think it's important to, and I think the new ways of doing things, new ways of doing outreach. I think there are positive aspects to it, and there are not so positive aspects to it. And so it's it's really important to be even-handed when talking about these things. But I think going back to the thing about people not being intelligent, I think there are kind of certain traits that most people have that we kind of have to overcome if we're going to successfully educate people to be vegan. I think one of those traits is humans are very much creatures of habit. There's a strong pull in people to carry on doing what they've always done. And obviously to become vegan is a big, is a big change from what they've always done. So that trait, that sort of familiarity type trait in people, pulls them away from veganism. There's also a trait in people to want to be the same as everyone else. They don't want to. Most people don't want to stand out from the crowd. And so, while when the majority of people aren't vegan, that's going to be a strong pull within people to away from veganism. And there are other traits as well in people, but I think those are perhaps the two main ones that we have to overcome in order to successfully educate people to become vegan.
Yeah, well, I'd agree with that, and there's a lot of sociological evidence to back that up, especially the kind of conformity part of it, in the sense that and again, although veganism is not a diet, a lot of people orient towards it as that, or at least as a large part of that. And again, sociologically, the kind of the worrying thing in a way is that one of the things that human beings are most conservative about is dietary things.
Yeah, and I think you look at those two things. I think first of all that people are creatures of habit. It's that you've kind of, in a sense, I think there's kind of two things with that. I mean, first of all, it's got to be, and it probably applies to both those aspects. The other one about people wanting to be the same as everyone else, that kind of the more familiar we kind of make veganism, and the more easy we kind of make it to kind of just sort of live as a vegan. I mean, obviously, veganism isn't, isn't primarily about food, or is kind of, in a sense, the food is just people living according to a philosophy they've adopted. Veganism about adopting a philosophy of animal liberation, isn't it? And then living according to that philosophy, which is where the food comes in, and other things come in. And so, but it kind of will make people not want to go there if they think they've got to eat in a way that might kind of ostracize them from society, or make it difficult for them to be with other people, etc., or that's unfamiliar. So, this is why it's kind of the more vegans we create, the easier it will be to create yet more vegans, because then veganism becomes more familiar. It becomes easier for people to live as vegans, and so they're more likely to kind of be prepared to take the philosophy on board, I think. And I think this is what, this is kind of why I think this is why there's been an increase in veganism in recent years, because I think that kind of the number of vegans reached a point where it wasn't so unusual to be vegan. It wasn't so difficult to live as a vegan, and so more people took that on. And I think you're talking about probably a series of tipping points, where I mean, like in the early days of veganism, it would have been like really hard to educate anyone to become vegan, which is why the Vegan Society celebrated so much when they found out that I was a vegan. Is oh, that's 2 this year we've had so far. Isn't it brilliant? And because it was so rare to be vegan, but obviously something's happened over the years where that's caused the number of vegans to increase, and I think that's just like a kind of what you might call a sort of
isn't that growth. I mean, that's a whole series of other things. I mean, I mean, I sometimes fear that the number of vegans is increasing, but not very much, and not as much as the number of plant eaters and plant-based people who call themselves.
Yeah, I think we've got other things coming into the mix now, because like that in the during the 1970s, when the animal rights movement was was in its early stages, and a lot of people were getting into it, and a lot of those people were becoming vegan. Those people were becoming vegan for ethical reasons, becoming vegan for reasons of animal liberation. Yeah, they weren't really thinking about the environment. Very few, there were some people even back then that adopted a vegan friendly diet for health, but it was kind of very much minority, and the big growth of veganism in those days was to do with people that that were vegan for animal liberation reasons. They may not have campaigned for veganism, and we were all campaigning on single issues back in those days, but the reason they were vegan was for ethical reasons, animal liberation reasons. But kind of in more recent years, there's been an increase in knowledge about the contribution of animal farming to the climate crisis, and to the ecological crisis as well, through the pollution and other forms of harm to the environment that it causes. So that there are more people these days, I think, that have adopted a vegan-friendly diet for reasons other than animal liberation. And then it's the same with health. There's been more knowledge about the health benefits, certainly of a healthy vegan diet.
That's why the distinction between plant-based and vegan is a good one. So long as, again, it's not pointing fingers, really.
Yes. But I think someone can adopt a plant-based diet or vegan-friendly diet because they're concerned about the environment, and then through rubbing shoulders or through learning about ethical, true veganism, ethical veganism, they can actually
and that's what the research suggests.
And it's the same with the to a certain extent, it's perhaps not so much, but to a certain extent the same with the health aspect.
Now Jeremy here is pointing out some of the nuances in a way, because name calling is unproductive. However, our outreach does not. It's got to disrupt, or at least I'd probably use the word challenge, and I think that's right. I mean, we've obviously got to challenge, but again, you see, then it's just a question of thinking, well, look, what is the setup here? And if you see yourself as an educator, and then you're almost like saying, okay, so it's a little bit like that sociological idea about recipient design. So, we design our talk with the person that we're talking to in mind.
Yes.
So if we want to educate them, well, the first thing you do is don't offend them and start calling them names, right? But it is true that we're going to have to push their boundaries. Otherwise, that's not education either. So there's this phrase about meeting people where they are. Yeah, but you can't do that for very long. You've got to shift it. Otherwise,
you meet them where they are, and then you move them forward from where they are.
Down the road,
you move them down the road, and I think that's important, and it's that balance of like being able to make people think about maybe something they never thought of before, but at the same time, still for them to still continue to like you, isn't it? It's like it's kind of
or at least not dislike you.
Not dislike you, because if they dislike you, then you.
I mean, obviously, the best thing is if they had a positive thing. The next, if it was neutral, that's not too bad. But if they have a negative experience, they're going to go home and say that goddamn, vegans. I've just been called an abuser by one of them. Blah blah blah. I've never abused an animal in my life, and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I'm going to eat an extra portion of meat tonight because of that.
But that still wouldn't, in their own belief system, make them an animal abuser. And if you want to say that it does, you're going to need a good argument. You're going to have to be able to try to get them. I mean, what I would do is just say, well, let's stop to think about the language we're using, and maybe let's use words like use, because you're opposed to animal abuse. But what about the use of other animals? And then, because it's almost as though you almost get the impression that modern activists think we've got to use the welfare language because it's the only one that people will understand, as though we don't have our own anyway. We've got language of rights, we've got language of liberation, and we've got language of social justice and stuff. We don't have to try and become a militant version of the RSPCA. That bit to me doesn't make any sense. So we don't have to talk about loving other animals. I mean, there's a movement at the moment in North America where they call other animals, regardless of age, babies. We're here to save the babies. Right? It makes me cringe, to be honest. But because it seems to, well, first of all, that takes the agency away from the individual other animals, but it also doesn't make our movement seem very serious, in the same way as the first thing people do if they want to hold up a sign is think about taking their clothes off. You think, well, that's lack of imagination or what? But it's we've got a serious message.
it's you know, say would we be saying would we be using the same language if we were campaigning for oppressed humans? You know, would people take their clothes off outside a concentration camp as part of a protest? And no, that would be immediately, that would be kind of, would be a no-no, wouldn't it? It would be considered to be kind of even sort of insulting to the people in there to kind of do that, wouldn't it? To, you know, to the victims. We would never.
Well, this is one of the differences, obviously, when you're talking about other animals, they can't, as it were, give us feedback and go, hang on a minute, don't say that about us. They can't do that. And so we've got free reign to say what we want on their behalf. You know.
And you know, if we're campaigning, you're campaigning for the liberation of other humans, including other adult humans, you don't refer to them as babies, do you? So why are we, if we're considering that other animals are just as other sentient animals are just as important as humans, and should not be oppressed any more than by humans, any more than other humans are, and exploited any more than other humans are, then we should be, you know, we should be approaching that in the same way, shouldn't we?
It's almost about just being real. I remember years ago seeing an advert on social media looking for a forever home for a little baby boy who turned out to be a 16-year-old dog, right? And but nevertheless, they were still characterized as a little baby boy, right? And a lot of people do say, well, it's because they're dependent, and that they require what Richard Ryder calls human superintendence and everything. But it's not as though they've got no agency at all. And you know, it seems to me, I think we're a little bit like that. You know, you go down the beach and a couple of dogs meet, and the owners go absolutely spare. You know, because they don't understand quite what's going on. You know, there's a bit of rough and tumble and a bit of growling and everything. That's just dog interaction, right? But you know, a lot of us are kind of, oh, you know, keep your dog away from my dog type thing, and even denying them, you know, socialization with their own species. You know, but that's because, oh, my baby, you know, my fur baby. And all that. It takes agency away from other animals. It seems to me that if you construct that, this bit, not sure what you think of this, Ronnie, because I don't kind of get this. I don't see how treatment language can be more hard hitting than use. I mean, if the idea is to stop use as opposed to alter treatment, then stopping use is obviously more hard hitting, isn't it?
Yes, I think a word like exploitation is harder hitting than use, and really means the same thing.
Yeah.
In terms of people's concept of it, I mean, I would tend to talk about exploitation and oppression. Really, are words I tend to use, and I think moral atrocities. Well, yeah, I mean, these are moral atrocities, aren't they? So once again,
well, people who are rather adverse to anything other than welfare language are going to go, well, they won't understand what that means.
Well, I think you've got to kind of you've sort of got to have a conversation with them about it, what it means, really, about the kind of, you know, so like morality of it, really, and then that's where the atrocity kind of comes in. You'd have to have a bit of a conversation with people first of all for them to understand.
Well, that's what I mean, and that actually leads into something that Vegan Pundit has said. Do you think these settings, you know, being on the street, as it were, and especially if you see, I think that quite a lot of these ones, the activist has got a timer going on in their mind because they want to keep it short because it's going to go on onto social media, right? And so they can't go on forever, and so therefore you don't have time to talk about the nuances. So we tried to get around this with VIP by creating what was called a tea station.
Yes.
Where people would sit down, like a little cafe area. People would sit down, and we'd have a pump pot with hot water, make them a cup of tea, and then that means that they could have a conversation as long as they wanted. And what we tended to find, which is why I came up with this concept of vegan curious, that everybody who kind of agreed to have a cup of tea, as it were, they had loads of questions about veganism. It's almost like, they had it all stored up because, I've been thinking about asking you about this and what about that. And of course, some of them are going to be the ones that we get irritated by, protein and all that kind of stuff, lions and all that. But again, we have to think that we're the educators here. They might be not asking that question to take the mickey. They might be asking that question because they've only just thought of it and they don't know the answer. Not that they want to try and win a point or something. So when they say, where do you get your protein from? I think vegans, because we've heard that question so many times, think, this person is taking the piss. But I don't think it necessarily is. I think that there's so much stuff about, vegans are weak and all these myths that go around and everything, that protein is a question that they think is relevant to asking if they're curious. I think it's as simple as that quite often.
Yeah. Yeah. And I tend to think if you're in a situation where you're only going to have the chance to engage with people for a short period of time, it's really important to give them literature to take away with them. If you know that you're not going to be able to enter into like a really full conversation with them because of the situation that you're in, then give them some literature that they can read and, to learn more about it.
Well, if I talk to people about animal rights, there'd be very little mainstream literature I could give anybody, because as soon as they open it up, it's going to start talking about cruelty and abuse again, isn't it? So, you've got to have your own for that to be consistent with what you're talking about, I think.
Well, yes. And I think like you can kind of create, what we do locally, we give out all sorts of information. We'll give information out from some of the national organisations, but we've also produced our own leaflet about our group and what we stand for, and we'll give people that as well.
Yeah, but the one that you like is the animal aid one, which has got kind of recipes, but also the ethics. But I mean, what is the language it's expressed in, though?
I haven't got it in front of me at the moment to be able to say. I don't think there's anything. I didn't really see anything in there that was too problematic, to be honest. It kind of just it kind of talks about the fact it's not necessary for the animal. We don't need to live. We don't need to kill animals in order to survive. And
that's not an ethical point, though, is it?
It kind of is, because if we don't need to, therefore it must be morally wrong to do so.
Okay, that creates okay. I suppose if the other way around, if we did need to, then there wouldn't be anything for us to say.
If we did need to, then we would be morally bound to kind of seek a solution to that.
That's when we'd all have to be welfareists then.
Well, I think we'd have to kind of see if we could, with technology, replicate the food we needed without having to kill animals. I think we'd have to go down that path if we were obligated carnivores, but we're not, and so that doesn't.
Bad news about the lab meats at the moment. Let me just address this one. In your country, did you need any particular permits to serve tea? No, we've done it in several locations. Never had any problems. There was one location where, in general terms, we had to have public liability insurance. And in some countries, that's really kind of cheap. So I think you can get it for 40, 50 quid a year. Whereas in Ireland, it was more than 300 euros. So it was particularly expensive. But because we had to have 8.5 million euros worth of insurance. And that was for things like if people tripped over the gazebo. And as I said a couple of weeks ago, Ronnie, the only person who actually tripped over the gazebo was a police officer.
Well, we're lucky. I mean, our insurance policy is about 80 something like £85 a year for our public liability insurance, and because we share that with other group, we only pay half of that. So it's obviously a lot cheaper here in the UK than it is in Ireland.
Oh yeah, it is, because often you'll hear adverts where it's even attached to kind of car insurance. For an extra 20 quid, you can get that as well, that kind of stuff. That doesn't exist in Ireland. This is great.
You just have to make sure.
When somebody asks where I get my protein from, I reply Lidl.
Lidl. Yeah,
that's good. That
yeah, that's fun. But yeah, and I think that the approach I have to outreach isn't at all a confrontation thing. It's really the aim is to provide people with information, really, and to to have an information stall and to have something on the stall that will attract people to it, so that people can come up, and then when they come up, then they can engage in a conversation, and that's kind of how like how I do outreach. I don't stand on the street with a microphone. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing to do, but I think if you are doing it that way, you've kind of got to do it in a way that doesn't alienate people.
Yeah, I also think that people probably think it's a religious thing if you did that, because that's often what happens in that sense. Linda said something good here, in the sense that I think the initial relationship that we have to create is mutual respect, or at least some form of rapport. That's what you need to create, right?
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, I find that I find there's more interest these days, in a sense, where, and I think quite a lot of it comes from the environmental thing, where people have heard about the benefits of a plant-based diet for the environment, and so it makes them more curious, and so they're kind of perhaps more. I've had people say, "Oh, great! Oh, this is great! Now I can learn more about this." That sort of attitude comes from people, I find, quite a lot with the stalls I do, because they've heard a bit about it, and then there's someone offering them information where they can learn more, and they're pleased that's there.
Yeah, but can you imagine if within 3 minutes of anybody coming to your stall, you were calling them an abuser? I mean, what's the point of that?
Well, there would be no point. And you see, if someone says to me, I'm no longer vegan, then immediately I'd say, well, why is that? Tell me why you're no longer vegan. And then whatever reason they give, then you kind of have a discussion about that.
One of the comments and an answer that I didn't use in the PowerPoint was that somebody said, I would have asked them why they are no longer vegan. And Cliff answered back and saying, well, I would have done that, but they ran off. And I thought,
but he didn't.
Why did they run off?
but his question should have come straight after they said that, and it didn't.
No, that's what I'm saying. They are, because and
it might be that person didn't understand what veganism really was, because they probably maybe talk about food. I didn't get on with a certain type of food or something. And then you could say, well, did you know that veganism isn't primarily about food? It's about animal liberation, and then have a conversation about that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a big part of it, and unfortunately, there is an audience for that. But one general point, which is why I always use the phrase cultural speciesism, is the fact that we have to understand the culture in which people are born, and it's the culture in which people are brought up in. So this is to do with primary socialization, and that is an incredibly powerful thing in our lives. It lays down some of our basic understandings of what we are, what we're all about, who we are in the world, our attitudes and our values and all that. It all starts there, and we usually get it from the family, but not always. But that is part of the culture. The family gets it from the general culture, And the general culture that we are born into and raised in is very deeply speciesist. So, you know, we in this conversation, the rapport that Linda's talking about, we've got to be the ones who understand this situation. That those people are just a reflection of their culture, and we're trying to challenge it, as Jeremy said, or confront it, or what was the phrase that was used? Disrupt it, right? So that is true. We have to do that, but you have to do it with an appreciation of the depth of the culture which the other person is kind of in. You know, they're a cultural product. You know, they're not just appear on the street out of nowhere.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You've got to understand how their minds operate. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do. You're not going to be like if you went to like repair a car, you've got to understand how a car works, haven't you? Otherwise,
yeah, but you see, going back to that point about meeting people where they are, well, where they are sociologically is within the culture of speciesism. So you're talking to a speciesist, but you're also talking to an animal welfarist. You're also talking to an animal lover, mostly. You're also talking to somebody who will swear that they hate animal cruelty and that they are totally opposed to animal abuse. So that's them. So that's a little conundrum. And you might say, well, there's some contradictory elements there. Well, that's for us to tease out. We can't tease that out by calling them names. No. You've got to go, okay, well, let's break this down. I mean, you've got to kind of, deconstruct it almost. But that's our job as the educator part of it.
Yes. And I think, the idea where people have this, what they would consider love for, dogs and cats, animals that they have in their homes. I think that can be used to promote veganism, but in the sense that they've become to know those animals as individuals. They know those animals as individuals, and if we can get them to think of other animals as individuals as well, that
but also a talking point there, Ronnie, is to point out that farmed other animals are never seen as individuals.
They're never seen as individuals, but they're just as individual.
So that gets us to think, well, why is that then? Oh, that's because we love one and we eat the other, right?
Yeah, so, but you see, but I think it's the fact that because they're familiar with those animals, they see the individuality of those animals, right? Because they just see animals like pigs or chickens or whatever animals they eat just as this mass of animals together type of thing. They don't understand. They don't like recognize the individuality of those animals. But it's a point of saying, well, look,
the ones they live with, the animal companions, they would not call them it. You wouldn't be there and you go, oh, how long has the dog lived with you? Oh, it came to me. They wouldn't say that. They'd be saying she or
not for one that they knew personally, certainly.
No.
But that's a way that they can they appreciate the individuality of those animals, to get them to appreciate the individuality, of other animals that they eat and other animals that they don't consider in the same way.
Yeah, actually, this is interesting in relation to what you've just said, because Joan Donnea was the only person who kind of argued for insect rights. It's kind of like most theorists in the movement have kind of steered away from that for kind of obvious reasons, really. But she didn't. But she also said you've got to think of every fly and every moth, etc., as an individual who will, if killed, that person will never come back into the world again. They're a unique individual.
I think that's true, and I think it's important to give them the benefit of the doubt, isn't it?
It's hard to think that way, though, isn't it? Of insects.
Well, I think because insects are so small, and it's so difficult to avoid harming them because they're kind of so small. isn't it? That's the problem. I think we should do our best to, to do that, to avoid harming them. But I think that's kind of one of the difficulties, isn't it, with insects is their size.
I bet the people who study them probably regard them as individuals much more than in general, right? Because they studied them, they see different personalities, and it's not a question of them just being stimulus response, all that kind of behaviorism type stuff. That they're almost like robots who've been programmed. They probably wouldn't see them that way, and so therefore they're much more likely, because of their ethology about them, to see them as individuals than the general public, I would think.
Well, I kind of think it's to do with any animals that we kind of become kind of familiar with. Really, I mean, I've got a friend who used to run a sanctuary for hens, and some years ago I spent a day helping her at the sanctuary, and she had all these hens that all looked exactly the same. I think they were like, nearly all of them were kind of Rhode Island Reds, I think, that had been kind of rescued from battery farms and places like that. And they all looked the same to me. But if I pointed to one, she could tell me everything about that hen. The health problems that hen had, when the hen came to the sanctuary, everything. She could distinguish between them all. She knew them all as individuals. But anyone just kind of looking at them would just think, oh, that's just like a flock of hens. And I think if any animals that we kind of become familiar with, we start to, understand them all as individuals.
Well, I mean, obviously human beings have got a terrible habit, even on racial grounds, of this thing about, oh, they all look the same type thing. And so obviously they're probably liable to do that in terms of speciesism as well. Jeremy, you were saying about the sanctuary. Feel free to put the name and the link in the chat for people to check that out. Right.
You see, I think with when kind of talking about welfare, it's like I think there can be some aspect, where people promote a welfaristic approach. I think there can be a concept of kind of, we were talking about weakness, tyranny of the weak. There can be a concept of weakness in that people promoting that think that people aren't going to be able to accept kind of stronger concepts. And so I'll kind of, I'll put forward this kind of weak idea of let's just improve things. And so people are going to be more willing to kind of accept that. And I think that might be one reason why people, kind of push a welfarist agenda.
Do you think it's this as well, Ronnie? Because I remember when I first met Jeremy, it was down at Veg Fest, and we had a conversation, and I said that, everybody knows that I really dislike the word mercy, especially if it's in a group name. And I was saying things like, if you're saying to people, have mercy and don't be cruel, that's not as strong as saying these other animals are rights bearers and you don't have the right to violate their rights. So could it be then that the reason that the softer thing is more attractive is because it keeps the agency with the human? Because you're not demanding, you're asking saying, please, you strong, powerful human, please have mercy, don't be cruel, rather than, oi, you can't do that.
Well, it's kind of like saying to a kind of slave owner, so to speak, please treat your slaves kindly, instead of saying, well, you shouldn't be a slave owner at all in the first place, and slavery shouldn't exist, isn't it? It's that kind of, Yeah,
but obviously the latter example is a stronger one.
Well, yes, of course it is. Yeah. That's right. And the other one's an example of weakness. But I think there's kind of this kind of two types of people that kind of really sort of promote welfare. I think there's those that promote welfare in the view, which I regard as a mistaken view, that it's going to lead to animal liberation. It's going to lead to the respect for animal rights. That they think that, but we can gain that through welfareism. So those people kind of are actually in their hearts animal liberationists. They think that the route to animal liberation is through welfare. Right? Yeah. There's those people, and then there's those people. Then there's another group of people that actually kind of, don't actually believe in animal liberation. They think it's okay for humans to exploit and oppress other animals as long as that's done, with without cruelty or with a minimum of suffering. So so they're people that actually think it's okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, Tobias Leonhardt, the vegan strategist, is one of those, because he would argue that it's beneficial for the other animals for us to have a symbiotic relationship with them and then therefore exploit them and use them than for them to fend for themselves.
Yes. But I think, you see, what you have to do, if you were to substitute other humans for those other animals, would that still be acceptable? And it wouldn't be, would it?
No, but I mean, well, speciesism is not something that this guy is going to bulk at particularly. But it's a kind of tactical argument, isn't it? The kind of, well, it actually benefits the victims kind of argument.
Yes. Yeah. But the idea that we can kind of arrive at rights and liberation through welfare, I think, is kind of it's not something I kind of go along with, because I think it's likely to have the opposite effect, and that it makes people think,
making consumers more comfortable.
It makes people think, well, it's like the the RSPCA Assured scheme. All it does is make people think that they can still carry on, consuming animal products, because
the argument against that is because, I mean, like when we first got introduced to the concept of new welfareism, that was 1996. It accepted that the new welfarists were abolitionists. It's just that they were taking a different route to it. And then once there was a bit of pushback to that, and then they ended up saying, well, new welfareism is not abolitionist and everything. But I think there is a big kind of push to thinking that you can eventually get there in that kind of step-by-step way. And they would argue against your point about it just makes them feel comfortable. They would say it gets them thinking about other animals in an ethical way at all, which they don't normally do.
Well, it doesn't, because how far does those ethics go? Because if it gets people thinking, well, we can still, these animals can still be used as long as the conditions they're kept in are improved. That's not, that's kind of that's not the ethics we want, is it?
No, it's just a question of almost like creating that initial spark that might go somewhere that we would call abolition.
I mean, with some people it might, but I think with a lot of people it will just give them an excuse to carry on.
The other side to that point is that if you ask for all or nothing, which is a misnomer, but if you ask for all or nothing, you get nothing. And so that's how they construct their position. First of all, you can't advocate for abolition, even though that's what you want. You've got to be a bit more of a politician about it.
But in reality, I think that's not the case, because what happens when these industries start feeling the pressure, they think, oh well, like more people are going vegan, we're losing revenue. What are we going to do? Then they'll adopt welfare measures in the hope that that will encourage people not to give up on consuming their products. And so campaigning for abolition does create welfare, even though it's not welfare that we want. That kind of is the effect of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. It's a deep irony, which none of the groups have taken on board. I mean, that comes from a sociologist called Richard Gale. None of the groups have taken that on board because of the kind of Norm Phelps kind of problem, which is that they can't see, and I think you've addressed this as well, they can't see that if your entire campaign was towards abolitionist veganism, they can't see that as the only thing to be done, even though this theory is saying, well, lots of things will be kind of like following in the wake, all this welfare stuff kind of thing. And you say, I think it was you said that the problem with that is fundraising, that they need to switch, kind of kangaroos then to, whatever, right?
Well, I think the thing is, with welfarist campaigns, you can kind of claim small victories, can't you? You can say, "Oh, look, we managed to kind of increase the size of these cages by a few millimeters. That's a victory, and send us money." Whereas, campaigning for people to go vegan is just the one campaign, isn't it?
Yeah, we kind of go, look,
we're
still campaigning for veganism. Give us more money, and they go, well, I've already donated to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think this is why a lot of these organisations, the national groups, have these kind of, they'll promote veganism, but they'll also have these welfarist campaigns as well, because that's the way they raise funds. Because if they can kind of close some farm down or get some supermarket to no longer source their products from
or get some farms red tractor,
or get them or expose. Well, I think the idea is exposing these RSPCA assured farms as having appalling conditions, the same as all the others. Is like a kind of sort of like one of the things they do. But I think the difficulty is that that kind of it's done for fundraising, because if they can claim victories on these things, then people will send the money and then go on to another campaign, and then people and ask for funds for that, and then another one, all these small sort of welfarist campaigns instead of the one big campaign for veganism.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose from a organization's point of view, it makes sense, but that creates another interesting topic that we've talked about endlessly. So are we about done, do you think, Ron?
Well, I think yes. I mean, I think we're pretty well. I think we probably. I think there's another area of weakness though, and it's to do with outreach, and it's to do with something that a lot of vegans are kind of into, and that is, we need as many vegans as possible to become involved in outreach. We need to spread the vegan message far and wide. But you see, a lot of vegans, or people who call themselves vegans, are resistant to that, and I think they're resistant to that. And I think that also has a lot to do with this kind of, not wanting to stand out from the crowds, not wanting to do kind of unfamiliar things, because like someone can be, and especially these days, it's important to kind of sort of think back to the old days when, like when I first became vegan, and way back in the 70s and 80s, that almost everyone that was a vegan was also an activist. And I think that was because it was so difficult to kind of operate in society as a vegan in those days, that you had to be have a kind of strength and determination about you. And so that same strength and determination and not being frightened to be different from other people meant that it was much more likely that people would be activists. But you see, I think what's happened these days is because it's so much
you're talking about
easier,
socially acceptable, aren't you? Really?
It's so that's easier to operate in society as a vegan. That what's happened is that people kind of, if you want someone to become a vegan activist, you've got kind of these two hurdles to overcome. First of all, it's kind of educating that people to become vegan in the first place, and kind of being different from other people in that sense, right? And that's that's a lot easier these days because veganism is not more familiar, and it's not easier to operate in society as a vegan now. So you kind of overcome that, but then you've got the other hurdle, like persuading that person to become an activist. And so becoming an activist is yet, you know, is another step away from the norm, isn't it? It's another step away from just being like an ordinary person and being the same as everyone else. You see, because now that in the old days, being a vegan, you were very, very different to everyone else, you know. But these days, being a vegan, well, you're not really so different as everyone else. You can eat food that looks exactly the same as they eat. You can eat in the same places they eat.
Well, the caveat there, and this is something that you said a long time ago, actually, about many more vegans about, is the fact that we've got to understand that in some places they're still isolated, aren't they, vegans?
I think in certain places they are. And I mean even in the UK, there are some places where that it's much easier to kind of operate in society as a vegan than in other places. I think that kind of still that's still very much the case. But certainly the situation in that sense is it's kind of in general a lot easier than it used to be some years ago. And I think what happens is people kind of because they kind of don't want to do unfamiliar things, they'll kind of I've become vegan and I've kind of I've kind of adapted my life to that. But like now you're asking me to kind of step outside of normality, so-called normality, even more by becoming an activist. And you see once again that that is, I'd say, an example of weakness, that those people they've kind of had enough strength to actually kind of become vegan, but the additional strength that it takes to become an activist, they kind of haven't got. They're not prepared to push themselves that extra bit to be an activist. And once again, that's an example of like, it's that weakness that is preventing us from achieving animal liberation, because in order to achieve animal liberation, we need lots and lots more activists to become.
We do have to take on board the fact that we are social animals, and that society can press down very heavily on the individual.
Yeah.
And everything we do is mediated by society, and in particular our peer groups. A lot of people. I mean, there are. I tuned into a live about 3 months ago now, and they were basically saying, veganism is very important to me, but my family is more important. So therefore, if my family is having problems about me being a vegan, then it makes my veganism more difficult and stuff. And so you could say, well, be a bit stronger about that, but they are just the fact that they're really tuned into family life and stuff.
Well, yeah, but I'd say once again that's like a kind of example of weakness, because they're like putting those relationships with their family above like a moral principle, aren't they? And the kind of horrific situation for other animals is kind of far more important and vital.
What I think they do in practice is that they try and balance the two things, and they're basically kind of like they'll stay vegan, but they'll go easy. They're not going to be evangelistic with their family and stuff, and that they'll put up with the kind of jokes that their family members might make about all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a kind of there's a tactical aspect of it. I mean, we all have to live within society, and those people are in a situation where they have to live within their family, and so I don't blame them for doing things in relationship with their family that kind of makes their life easier, but that kind of doesn't prevent them from doing outreach, like amongst other people, does it?
No, I agree with that. Yeah. I mean that wouldn't.
And I think this is that's a problem, and this is a form of weakness within the vegan community that's preventing us from achieving animal liberation, because people don't have that strength to become active and to go out and promote veganism.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, but I just think there's a lot of factors.
I think there are a lot of factors, but I think those are factors that people can overcome, and unless sufficient vegans do sort of overcome whatever it is that's holding them back from outreach, then we're not going to achieve animal
We're not
liberation.
going to do it. Yeah, that's right.
We're not going to do it. And if those people believe in animal liberation, if the reason they're vegan, and if they're properly vegan, that will be the reason they're vegan, is because they believe in animal liberation. Then how are they going to achieve what they believe in unless they become part of this huge outreach?
I see that. All I'm saying is people are going to naturally try and juggle a few things and try.
I think you can. I think we all do, and I think anyone that is in a family, within a family situation, I think you kind of always, there are always compromises to be made. When you're in a family situation. I mean, certainly if I just lived on my own, there'd be, I probably would live in a way that was a lot more ethical than I do in a family situation, because there's stuff as a family that you kind of do jointly, and you have to kind of compromise on things that other people want and stuff like that, you see. But I think,
Ronnie, look, I think we're getting hints here. I think we're
people are thanking us, but
I think people are basically saying, "Good show, people, but now get off. You've been on too long." I think that's what.
They want to go and make a cup of tea. Well, I do as well, but I think it's been a good discussion, and I think that it's like, the discussion about welfare and language, I think is an important one, and something that people need to think about.
There's always one. No,
stay. Yeah. Someone's got a lot. Yeah, but I mean,
that's the first question we've dealt with there, Ronnie. The second one is,
but I think that's one. I think that we've kind of got to be. You see, we're talking about a very, very simple principle here. Is that we've got one species on Earth that's a tyrant over the others, and there's no moral justification for that whatsoever, no moral or rational justification for that whatsoever, and we've got to be very clear about that. We've got to be very clear about other animals have rights that should, and humans should respect them, and animals should not be oppressed or exploited. Other animals should not be oppressed or exploited by humans, and that's the kind of absolute. We have to make that clear all the time. All right, you can kind of make that clear in a sort of gentle, friendly way, but that kind of needs to always be made clear. That's the basis of everything.
Yeah, well, we should just call them abusers. That'll do it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think it's fully time for us to go. Did you see the bit about that? You both have impressive bladders. So
well, mine's becoming less impressive, which is another reason that we need to go. I've got a bottle. I haven't got an impressive bladder.
Yeah,
I've got a very impressive bottle.
I had no idea that Jeremy had seen them personally. But,
yeah.
So there you go. Okay, people. So bladders apart. We've
got our new show next week.
We do.
Next Tuesday, same time, same place.
Yes.
We'll be talking about interesting items of news relevant to the vegan and animal rights community, provided that we are still alive.